which is dealing with the international collaboration on forest, interagency collaboration, the collaborative partnership on forest, and also communication and outreach. And what I will be talking about to you now is a very boring topic. This is the most boring of all what you have. So if you survive this, then you survive the whole program after that. And also, please feel free to interrupt me anytime if you think you are interested in something, or if you feel that you are absolutely not interested in what I'm saying, then just interrupt me and then we move to the next topic. But before we start going into this, let me ask you a question. If you have an answer, great. If you don't have an answer, that's fine as well, because most likely by the end of the presentation you would. But the question is, why do you think it matters how is the international forest governance? Why is it important? Who are the players in leading the work on forests globally? Any idea about that? Anybody? Yeah. Just speak up, please.
It's fine. So globally, we know that forests act as a carbon sink, and we need to monitor those sinks globally. So it's given that governance also matters a lot in understanding how they, how the productivity can be increased. So in that respect, forest governance internationally is also important. We also saw in our tour that for certification for various forest products is also very important. That it ensures that forests are sustainably being managed. So in that aspect also, forest governance internationally will look into this aspect. So there are various aspects that come into in this thing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Very good answer. Actually, you don't have to listen to my presentation. You already know everything. But yes, a little bit to talk about this and try to figure out first how this thing is working. Yeah, so yes, you mentioned a couple of things. You mentioned climate change, you mentioned certification. Yes, there are many issues in forestry that are relevant one way or another. And then when UFRO-led group of scientists analyzed the international forest regime back in 2010, they concluded that actually it's very complex and quite fragmented, and they found that over 80 instruments are dealing on the global and regional scale with forests one way or another. But there is no one single what is called forest instrument, and that is the reason for the fragmentation. But the big question is, why is this fragmentation there? So you started answering or telling the content of this slide, because the question is, what is forest really? It's for many reasons disappears as land, especially when you want to use the land for something else than forest, like agricultural production, human settlements, whatever. So there's a need for a regime that is dealing with the land. But it's a lot is depending on the main products from forest, that is wood. So for many, forest appears like wood, nothing else. And there are other reasons where we are focusing on forest. It's important from the biodiversity perspective, for example, right? Or you mentioned climate change. Yes, as a regulator of major cycles, be it about the carbon cycle, the climate, the water cycles, etc. So forests, because they are covering 30% of the land area, they are providing very important regulatory services. But this is also a source of livelihood. So in some cases, this is not that much about the land or the biodiversity, but the value that the forests provide, or the energy. This is super important because half of the wood harvested in the world is actually used for energy generation, and in some countries this is higher than 90%, especially in Africa. So imagine that only 10% of the wood harvested is not burned one way or another. It's a huge amount because we are talking about almost 2 billion cubic meters of wood. And also, this is very important for health, for human health. Most of the medicines we use are actually coming from forest, one way or another, even if this is not recognized often. And the money is going to Pfizer and Bayer, not to the forest owners, but they are working with remedies coming from the forests. And it's also a spiritual value, very important thing. So for many, this appears to be the most important function of the forest. So yes, there are many dimensions of forest, and there are instruments that are dealing with these dimensions of forest one way or another. And in the international governance regime, we have legally binding instruments, which are the conventions. We have non-legally binding instruments that, for example, the UN Forest Instrument or the Forest Principles or FAO voluntary guidelines. And then there are the treaty-based organizations like C4, ITTO, and FAO itself. There are the other kind of intergovernmental organizations like IUCN, UFRO, UNDP, UNEC. Then there are the performance-based entities, which are the certification schemes, for example, PEFC or FSC, or the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And then there are several regional processes dealing with forest on a regional scale. And then there are new entities emerging, voluntary and temporary alliances of groups of countries. So they are all dealing with forests in one way or another. And of course, they are having different focuses, and there is aims and ambitions. So this is where the complexity is coming from. Looking at the conventions, there is, as you know, there is no forest convention in the world. There was an attempt in '92 to have one, but that was not successful. So we have the 3 Rio Conventions. The 4th could have been the forest instrument, but this didn't happen. So we have one on biological diversity, we have one on desertification, and we have one in climate change. They are all one way or other related to the '92 conference in Rio de Janeiro, the Earth Summit. Then there are other instruments that are actually much older. They were focusing on specific things, like the CITES, which is the Convention on Trade in Endangered Species. This pretty old one from '73. Or the Ramsar, which is dealing with the wetlands from '71. These are not particular forest instruments, but because of the subject, forests are necessarily included in their thematic scope. Then there is one instrument, this is pretty much the closest to forest, and that is the ITTA, the International Tropical Timber Agreement from '94. This is the basis also for ITTO's existence. And then we were talking about the spiritual values. There is the World Heritage Convention, and then another dimension as a regulator of global cycles, there's the Ozone Convention, and then the spiritual values, again, the indigenous and tribal peoples, or the World Trade Organization Treaty from '94. So these are, you don't have to take notes because the presentations you will have anyway, so everything that I'm saying here, it will be available for you. So these are all instruments that are not forest instruments, but have, as the colleague said, for example, in relation to climate change, they have very important provisions for forest. The issue is that these provisions are developed pretty much independently. So when the UNFCCC comes up with something, that is one thing, and then when the CCD or CBD comes up with something that is again different, and these are not necessarily coordinated with each other. So there is where the fragmentation in the international regime is coming from. And there's one legally binding instrument on forest that was established in 47 and then brought to FAO in 59, and that is the International Poplar Commission Convention. This is legally binding, this is global, this is forestry only, but the thing is that it's very limited in scope because this up until now it has been about poplars and willows. The scope has been extended a couple of weeks ago to include other fast-growing species, but still it's still very limited. Only 30-something countries are the members. So only when we are looking at the conventions we have that many, and there could be some others who are partially relevant for forests. So yes, the Rio Conventions, they have important elements, be it about the land use change, be it about the national action programs against desertification, be it about REDD+, or the extended program of work on forest biological diversity of the CBD, or the Aichi biodiversity targets. They are all very important. And at the same time, when these instruments were born, on forest there were only two documents, the Agenda 21 and the Forest Principles. Both were non-legally binding and voluntary and aspirational. One offspring of the onset in '92 was the establishment of one political body in forestry, that was the Intergovernmental Panel on Forest, that was active for 2 years, and that was followed by the Intergovernmental Forum on Forest for an additional 4 years. And these negotiating bodies were the first ones which took the forestry discussion out of the forestry circles and moved them to New York and have more the political circles together with the professional circles included in the negotiations. These bodies created a huge number of recommendations, altogether 270, which is pretty much everything under the sun, but neither one was legally binding, so it was left for the countries to decide to what extent they wanted to follow and apply those recommendations. And the key issues remained open. The key issues regarding financing for sustainable forest management, regarding the legally binding nature and others. But one important outcome of this process was that finally the countries agreed to establish one permanent body on forestry, and that was the UN Forum on Forest, which became part of the international arrangement on forest. The international arrangement is UNFF and a collaborative partnership on forest together. And the aim was to promote sustainable forest management and strengthen the political commitment to this, kind of replacing the legally binding nature of an instrument or substituting it, and then promote implementation and provide a dialogue for discussion on forest issues on the political level. The UNFF itself is the first permanent political body in forestry, and that is part of the ECOSOC machinery. It is a functional commission of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. It started its work for a 5-year period and had two main tasks: to elaborate a parameter for a mandate for a legally binding instrument in the forest, and work on financial and technology transfer, in particular a possible global forest fund. As you all know, neither one is existing, nor the legally binding instrument, neither the Global Forest Fund. So you may say that UNFF did not deliver on this key mandate in the first 5 years, and if you say this, this is most likely true. On the other hand, it generated several additional valuable products. So based on this, in 2006, the countries decided to give an additional mandate and decided also that maybe it's better to move away from a legally binding agreement discussion, because obviously the conditions were not there. And since '92 till 2005, in those 13 years, a lot of discussion took place, neither one resulting in an agreement. So the countries said that maybe it's better to let it rest a little bit and focus on some other things where we can come closer together, where we can agree more than on this legally binding agreement thing. And finally, they indeed did agree on a non-legally binding instrument in forest, which is, if you look at the text and you look at the content, it is almost like a convention. The major difference that there is no binding force behind, there is no compliance mechanism there, so it's entirely up to the country's voluntary commitment and political commitment to implement the non-legally binding instrument. But content-wise, that would be pretty much okay as a convention. So quite recently, in 2015, together with the SDG process, the international arrangement of forest was reviewed, and the conclusion was that yes, this is a good way forward. Maybe we should continue working together. Maybe we will arrive one day at a discussion on a legally binding instrument or a global financial mechanism for forest. But before doing so, let's work a little bit on strengthening the contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. Let's strengthen the collaboration and cooperation in each forms, north-south, south-south, triangular, etc., and try to strengthen the governance and the means of implementation without having an instrument or a financial mechanism in place. So UNFF these days working somewhat differently. It has annual sessions, whereas in the past it had biannual sessions. Every annual session is 5 days long. And then there's a strategic plan on how to spend the time between now and 2030 in the UNFF sessions. And according to this plan, what kind of issues would be discussed in the coming 10 plus years. In 2024, which is a sort of a half time of the lifespan of the current UNFF arrangement, there would be a review to consider whether there was any progress, or by then there will have any progress being made towards a legally binding instrument or towards a global forest fund, and see whether the time is right to return to those discussions, or if not, then continue with the current track and take this decision then in 2030. You may say that that's not a very ambitious or super fast-track approach. And if you say this, again, this is true, but the experiences showed that the stronger attempts to come to a conclusion on these issues did not succeed, and then too much energy was spent on discussing these issues, leaving others unattended. So this is the reason for this more cautious two-track approach. Also, in order to enhance the work on forests, there was another instrument adopted in 2017, and this is the United Nations Strategic Plan for Forests. Theoretically, this goes beyond UNFF. It is for the whole UN system, so theoretically, every UN entities, the conventions, the specialized agencies like FAO, the programs like UNDP, UNEP, etc., they should also consider this program and make a contribution to this. Certainly, these instruments, these separate instruments, have their own governance mechanism that takes precedence most of the cases over the UN strategic plan. So the plan itself is more binding for the UNFF and its machinery than for anybody else, but at least it provides a common platform for the different entities in the UN system to talk to each other. But more importantly, it has 6 global forest goals, which are somewhat similar to the Sustainable Development Goals, and it has 26 associated targets. These are the goals and objectives and targets that the countries agreed to work towards and report on voluntarily how much progress they were able to make. And then I would like to record just one of those 26 targets, and this is the increasing forest cover by 3% by 2030. So this is a very ambitious target, because so far the forest area of the globe was declining or decreasing with a lessening speed, but still decreasing. And now the countries committed themselves not only to stop the decrease, but actually reverse the trend and start to increase the forest cover. Whether this will be possible to achieve or not, we will see, but this is a very noble approach, and if it is working, then this would be one of the biggest achievements of the global community. One important thing is that the strategic plan, which is for a very long period of time, is implemented in 4-year clusters. The quadrennial program of work is the one that defines what actually is expected to happen in the international negotiations on forest issues in the coming 4 years. The current one runs till 2020. And then the next session of UNFF, which will meet about a month and a half from now, we'll start the discussion also on what the next 4-year plan could be and what the countries in the UN system is expected to do in relation to the UN forest instrument. Okay, so that was about the New York machinery and the higher political discussion. But let's have a look a little bit about what we, like specialized agency as FAO, are doing in forestry. As you know, FAO was established in 1946. It was established in Quebec City in Canada, and then in the first year it was operating from Washington, D.C. Then it moved here to this very building in Italy, and since then it is here. The main reason for establishing FAO was to have an organization that is dealing with agriculture, food security, and natural resources issues, and two of the three global goals of FAO actually related exactly to this, to enhance the economic and social progress and well-being for all, including fighting poverty and hunger, and then make sure that the world's natural resources are used in a sustainable way. So this is why we have here forestry, this is why we have here fisheries and agriculture and other departments dealing with this. When FAO was established, there was no specific body in forestry. Forestry issues were discussed by the FAO Council, by the FAO Conference, and this was so till 1972. But on the regional scale, there were regional forestry commissions established very soon after the Second World War. As you see that in Europe, it was in 47, and then in Latin America 40, the Asia-Pacific region where India belongs to 49, Near East 52, Africa 59, and North America 59 as well. So there were, pretty soon after the establishment of FAO, these regional bodies created where the senior officers of the countries were discussing critical polity issues for the region. And finally, the conference in 71 took a decision to create a global body for forestry, and this is the Committee on Forestry. This is which currently I'm the secretary of. And then also there were other bodies created in FAO. There was the International Poplar Commission that I mentioned already, and there was another regional body, the Silva Mediterranea, which is actually the Mediterranean is a meeting point of three regions, Europe, Near East, and Africa, and these three regional forest commissions created this specific committee, because this is indeed unique in that sense that it's rather multicultural, very long human history there, very strong use of natural resources, relatively low forest cover, and high share of agriculture and pasture land, so there the ecosystems are somewhat different, and also this is one of the driest areas of the world. It's pretty much a dry zone with rather unique forest ecosystems. And then in the 60s, there was a need to focus more on the forest products. So this is when the Advisory Committee on Sustainable Forest-Based Industries was created. This is a unique body because this is composed of not government representatives, but representatives of the private sector. So these are the business people, and this body is advising FAO on issues that are related to production, trade, etc. in forest products. And there's a rather new body. This is the Intergovernmental Working Group on Genetic Resources. Yes?
What exactly is the role of FAO as far as forestry is concerned? Is it conservation of forests, or is it agroforestry, or is it looking into the forest products? Because agriculture and forests as a whole are quite, doesn't look not a complementary.
Yes, it's a very good question. Actually, all of these and many others. So the overall, the main mandate of FAO is to promote the sustainable management of the world's forest. And that includes many things. That includes collection of information about the state and development of the forest resources, collecting information on the performance in the forest sector. In the forest sector, you should understand from the primary wood production up to the tertiary forest products, which is furniture and printing paper and boards and panels. So to see what is happening in the forest sector overall in terms of production, trade flows, etc. It is also meant to provide technical advice to countries on a number of issues, from silviculture to forest health to fire management to monitoring, assessment and reporting, wildlife management, agroforestry, anything that you can imagine we have in the portfolio. So this is the technical advice part. And then we are providing information services. We are not just collecting information, but we are making this information available for the countries to help them better base their forest policies or strategies and plans. And also we are providing a platform for the countries to come together and talk to each other. So what we actually are doing as FAO staff is not something that we invent for ourselves. We have these bodies, the Committee on Forest and Regional Forestry Commissions, and they're the countries in a one-week discussion every 2 years come up with a set of requests to FAO, and they say that, okay, we, the countries, are paying your salaries, guys, and this is true. So everything you see here is paid for the countries, including my salary. And for this money, the countries tell us what they want us to do. So from these governing bodies, we're always getting a list of actions that we are expected to perform, and we actually convert this into our work plans and budgetary planning. This is finally approved, then this is what this chart is about, by the top-level intergovernmental bodies in the organization, and then we started working on those, and 2 years on, we go back to the COFO, to the Regional Forestry Commission, and tell that you, the countries, told us to do 100 things, and this is what we have done in implementing your recommendations. These are the results, etc. So everything that you ask is in the portfolio and beyond that. And certainly there's a shift in the attention, because there are times when climate change is the key focus, then biodiversity becomes a focus, then fire management becomes the focus, then trade becomes the focus, payment for environmental services is a key issue, financial flows in the forest sector. We are working on that very strongly these days. Governance issues, land tenure, access to land, secure tenure system, concessions, etc. So it's if you go to the FAO website, you go to a product which is called Moving Forward. There you always see what in the last 2 years, what in the last biennium we did as a most important activity, and what were the outcome of those. Does it answer the question? Okay. So yes, this chart is exactly about this. So down on the yellow part, these are the regional forestry commissions. This is where the colleagues, your regional forestry commission will meet in Korea, Incheon, second half of June, for a 1-week meeting. And from that meeting, there will be a set of recommendations coming to us. This recommendation will be taken to 2 bodies, to the Regional Conference for Asia Pacific and to the Committee on Forestry. And then these bodies will be looking at not only what the Forestry Commission in Asia Pacific is saying, but also all the fisheries commissions, the tuna commission, this commission, that commission, all the others. And they will make a prioritization, and they will say, okay, this is what we want FAO to do in the coming biennium. Then this recommendation through the Program and Finance Committees, who are the quality and number checkers here, they will approve this plan or request recommendations, and then finally this is taken to the council, and through the council to the conference, and the conference will take place at the end of June this year, the last days of June and the first day of July, and the conference will agree on the program of work and budget for the organization for the next 2 years. So the countries in the conference will tell us what they want us to spend $2.5 billion in the regular program, and God knows how many billions in the extra budgetary program. This is what we are expected to do in the coming 2 years. So when you go to the FAO website, there's always the PWD, the Program of Work on Budget. You can tell exactly what will be the activities of the organization focused on. Yeah, okay, this is mostly covered. One word about the Committee on Forestry. So the Committee on Forestry does on the global scale exactly what the regional forestry commissions are doing on the regional scale, reviews the situation of forestry and advises countries on what the wisdom of the global community suggests to do in terms of promoting SFM, and they will also tell what they want the organization to do, and then anything that is budgetary or programmatic is taken to the FAO Council. This is a body of 47 countries elected for 3 years, and anything that is policy relevant is taken to the conference, and this conference includes all 193 member nations of the organization. So partly an answer to your question, what we are doing here, we are doing several preparing several normative products. We are preparing voluntary guidelines on the widest range of issues, from the responsible governance of tenure to national forest monitoring, phytosanitary codes, fire management, concession guidelines, climate change for policymakers, etc. These are normative products. Neither one is binding legally. It's up to the country to decide to what extent they are applied, but they represent the best knowledge that is available in the world related to that subject. We are also developing certain norms and standards. This is how FAO, the international statistics, are collected. And there are recommendations when the countries agree to suggest, to try to do this and that. If you read these reports, then you will read that the Committee on Forestry encouraged countries to, and there is a set of actions that appears to be prudent to take in order to achieve a certain objectives. But this COFO is also talking to other bodies, because you mentioned earlier certification or the climate change. So sometimes the Committee on Forestry, as a voice of the global forest community, comes up with a recommendation for the UNFF, for the Climate Change Convention, or for others, to ask them or to suggest them to consider certain information or certain recommendation from the forest community. And as I said, certainly the country through these bodies are guiding us. So this is how FAO is working. And lastly, one very interesting mechanism, which is rather unique in the United Nations system, this is a collaborative partnership on forest. It is unique in that sense that there is no alliance of this kind any other in the system. This is an alliance of 15 international organizations with global mandate on forestry. This includes the Convention Secretary, CBDCC, the UNFCCC CITES. It includes the financial organizations like the Jeff Secretariat of the World Bank. This includes research organizations who are members of the CJAR mechanism like C4 or ICRAF. It includes specific organizations like the IUCN, which is not part of the United Nations system, and it's an intergovernmental or international NGO, or it includes the UFRO, which is the International Union of Forest Research Organizations. So all in all, we are 15, and the unique thing is that 15 organizations, even if they have different governance structures, they have different mandates, they are able to come together and work together on forest issues. This is all voluntary. This depends on the decision of the executive management of those organizations, but it's been working since 2001, and it has produced several good results in forestry. Certainly, it was created under the UNFF, so the main function is to support the work of the countries under the UNFF, but in doing so, the partnership delivers lots of tangible results. For the time being, we have 10 joint initiatives in the CPF. Some are related to communication, like the Wangari Maathai Award, but there are other projects running on forest finance, forest landscape restoration, the newest initiative promoting sustainable wood for a sustainable world, but we are doing work on streamlining forest-related reporting, and this is how we came up, for example, with a global core set of forest-related indicators, which is a set of, for the time being, 15 or 16 parameters, which are expected to be used by all entities who are dealing with forest information. So this is pretty much what I wanted to tell you about the forest governance, telling that it's a very complex, very complicated system with several actors. Neither one is having full control of forestry, but everybody is having an influence over a certain part of the forestry. And I wanted to mention to you two key instruments. One is the UNFF, which is a political body dealing with the policy aspects of forestry, and the other one is FAO, which is kind of in between policy and practice, having an important policy role through these governing bodies and through the platforms for the countries to negotiate issues related to forest, but also a considerable implementation capacity in the organization with over 200 forestry professionals working here in headquarters and in the field on forest issues. issues. So this would be, as I said, it's a pretty boring topic, and most of you will not necessarily meet with these issues in the everyday life. But when something stupid is happening, then it's good to remember, this is mostly because the system is too complex and complicated. So if nothing else, this may be the message that you can take with you. Is there any question after this long introduction from me? Yes, sorry, so here is one, and here's one. Please use the microphone so that everybody can hear.
Good morning, sir. My question is, I wanted to know that till what extent are we going towards making this a legally binding instrument in terms of the global landscape? Because obviously there are a lot of ifs and buts since it comes to the forests, and obviously we have the world divided over a lot of issues related to the forest, especially the climate change. So how far do you think that forests will hog the limelight when it comes to coming to an agreement on a legally binding, a kind of an instrument that will ensure that the forests are protected, and the target of achieving that 3% by 2030, that increase, that can be feasible?
Yes, this is a very good question. The problem is that if I were having the answer for this, I wouldn't be here. I would be most likely in Stockholm receiving the Nobel Prize in Forestry. But it's a very good question because, yes, there is an aspiration to have, in several countries, to have a legally binding instrument on forests, but the more time we have spent, the more the question comes up, what would be the role of this? Because while we are discussing the forest issues, there is a development in the world, and then, yes, there is the climate change instrument, which has very important provisions for forests. There will be, in 2020, the CBD and the new program negotiated. It's a good question what kind of provisions that we'll have. There is the current strategic program under the CCD and all the other instruments. So by the evolution of those instruments, we always need to ask the question, okay, so what is left for a forest instrument to take care of? And it's very difficult to answer, and so much so that this is one of the fundamental issues why there was no agreement on a forest instrument so far. So yes, the big question is the review and the consideration to the need and the potential role of a legally binding instrument in forests will take place in 2024, but we don't know how the world will be looking like 5 years from now because we don't know the new climate change things, the CBD things, etc. So that will be a very pertinent question, and at some point, this is my personal opinion, not official opinion of FAO, if at some point we may find foresters, we may find ourselves in a situation where maybe we are ready for an agreement, but actually there is no room left for such an agreement. That is a real risk, and this has been sort of a challenge ever since this discussing started, because again, the discussion seriously started in '92. Today is 2019, and this is 24. So 92, 24, it's a huge period of time, and the world has been evolving. So yeah, very good question. I assume at this moment nobody has the answer for that. One thing that everybody says that an instrument on forests could do is to bring some stronger consistency and streamlining into this rather fragmented global mechanism or governance regime in forestry, and many countries believe that an instrument could one way or another be associated with means of implementation. That is the aspiration of many countries who say that we are certainly know how to conduct sustainable forest management, but we are having troubles with establishing the economic foundation for those activities. And then there was a question there. Hi. Yes, yes. Same thing, then there was a question in the back.
FAO is working from agriculture and forestry perspective. Agriculture is mainly privately governed property in all global sphere. Whereas when we see forestry, then in Asian and African continent, it is mainly public government. Whereas in some countries of Europe, it is privately owned. So do you think that Asian countries should also shift towards more tilt towards privately owned of forestry, or European countries should shift towards public governance of forestry?
Yeah, this is also a very good question. So if we are looking at the a global map of forest ownership, then we see that forests are overwhelmingly owned by the public, by governments. It's true for the larger part of the world. And there are certain parts of the world, and Europe one of those, where actually the ratio is pretty much the opposite, like 30% public and 70% private. The United States even stronger. Truth is that just by ownership, you cannot decide that this is better or that is better, because there are good examples and bad examples in both realms. So if you say that the public ownership in forest is to be maintained for guaranteeing the non-commercial functions, the public welfare functions of the forest, then you would say that having a majority of forest in public hands is a good solution. Still, what we see is deforestation for a long time. So, and even in countries where the forest area is overwhelmingly owned by the state. Or we see countries where the forest is overwhelmingly public, still the forest area is increasing. So most likely ownership itself is not a solution to anything. What the common wisdom says so far is that ownership, you cannot decide on what ownership is better, because it depends on many things. It depends on the history of the country, it depends on traditions, it depends on the economic system, it depends on many things. But what everybody says, independent of the ownership, as very important for good and sustainable forest management is a secure tenure system, the access to resources, the access to information, the access to knowledge, and secure and predictable rights and systems in the economy, because these are the preconditions for any long-term thinking. If you believe that the ownership will change in 2 years' time or in 5 years' time, you certainly will not invest into anything long-term because you are afraid of losing that investment. This is particularly true for the private sector. If you don't have information, if you don't have access to information, you cannot start anything because you don't know what will be the result of your activities. If you have no equal rights, then you are not in a mood of investing into something because you fear of losing your investment. So then the security, the predictability is very important, and compared to this, the ownership is secondary. As long as this is predictable, as long as this is just, as long as this is stable and secure, then either one could work well, and we have ample examples for that. So we cannot take any element of a good governance scheme out of the context and focus on that, because everything depends also on the relations. Any more questions, which doesn't seem to be the case? Then I really thank you for not falling asleep during the presentation and having energy for asking a couple of questions at the end. And I was requested to inform you that from now on you will be having a 15-minute break just to recover from this presentation, and then after that the program will continue as it was in your plan. Again, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.